Welcome back to Selling Circular, the podcast where we rethink and challenge capitalism through the intersection of commerce and circular business model innovation. This week, we're exploring a concept that has been gaining traction in sustainability circles, the degrowth movement. I'm Sabira Lakhani, VP of Product at Reaply.
I'm Gar Punnett, CEO of LoopLayer. If this is your first time, we're thrilled to have you to be a part of our community in advancing the circular economy. And the best way to help our growth is to share clips, subscribe or tell your friends, and probably more than anything, tell your colleagues about the podcast. But speaking of growth, then, we got to talk about the opposite, potentially degrowth. And don't let the name fool you. It's not necessarily about less of everything. It's about reimagining our economic systems to prioritize both ecological sustainability and social well-being over endless economic growth. So I love this episode. You're going to hear how uncomfortable I am with this concept. Why we even entertained this concept is because it challenges the notion of circular economy and material extraction for continued economic growth and really puts it in the frame of why. And really is that to what end? To the social, to the economic, who is that benefiting and what's the social justice element of this? I attended a degrowth cafe. I got to meet a bunch of the participants who really were bringing their social messages. What I loved most about this in terms of the Degrowth Cafe is it kind of felt like, truthfully, if we're in the phase of late stage capitalism where it's a lot of corporate capitalism, more about shareholder sort of corporate capitalism, that this felt kind of like a McCarthy era socialism meeting, where if we're really in the late stage capitalism, then degrowth is the enemy of capitalism. But that's not totally true. This is really about trying to find the human centeredness of what essentially our systems are built to support. They're built to support us, not economic growth. And so, but in that still, it was very interesting to be in that context of who believes in capitalism, why do they believe, why do they not believe? Is it the solution that we need, or do we start to need to rethink it in the way that we just introed to serve our human needs? And so that's what I love about this podcast is, again, how you're going to hear it actively challenging my gears when I start to talk to John. And so that's ultimately where we find ourselves really trying to talk through what is quite a heady subject.
Yeah, I think I was intrigued by it. I think it comes across as like highly theoretical and it really challenges your mind. And what I took away was that degrowth philosophically isn't against technology or against progress, but tries to represent the intentional ecological and social mindedness of innovation and thinking about downscaling our global economy in a way that we can kind of achieve balance for humans and balance for nature and not necessarily, yeah, I think Gar, you said this earlier, like not chasing growth for the sake of growth, right? Like chasing growth for or the right amount of resources and resource allocation that we need.
Yes.
So to help us think through all this and introduce all these very new concepts to some of us, John Mulrow joined us on the show. He has dedicated his studies to understanding the degrowth movement and is the co-founder of a Degrowth Institute. He has a background that spans sustainability consulting and military service. So he has a really unique perspective on the conversation and thinks about economic limits and planetary boundaries in a really interesting way.
What we need to understand is this is an essentially a thought leader who has the academic pedigree, brings the PhD level work from his sustainability work, but really essentially realized that efficiency gains coming out of circular economy or sustainability weren't enough, in his opinion, to address full environmental challenges. So with that, this is where we get to jump into the episode, as he really is tirelessly working towards building the degrowth movement, organizing cafes, book clubs, and even planning for a degrowth school for 2025. It's, again, another eye-opening discussion for myself, but I really love the way that you put it, Sabira. The movement's about balance. The movement is about intention and really trying to understand how do we build a model of the future that's equitable and sustainable for more people. And that might involve some of the conversations around degrowth. Enjoy. I've debated how to start this conversation back and forth in my head almost all week. I don't want to start by providing a negative view of what is the degrowth movement and by way and essentially what it's trying to have consumers understand. But I do think it's interesting in terms of counter-positioning where the degrowth movement is currently, in which when doing research for how to approach this topic, I could not help but be overwhelmed by the negative press that comes in about degrowth and how radical it is. Juxtaposed to that is essentially the mission of degrowth, which is also foundationally trying to find a sustainable limit where more people can prosper. How do you, in doing this research, balance what is considered such a radical thought of degrowth with ultimately such a wholesome purpose of trying to get more communities to benefit in some of these systems that we've designed in the US and maybe global north, and how that maybe is different in other parts of the world?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. You basically said, I'm not going to ding degrowth, but how do you respond to the people who do?
That's basically it.
Who do
And that's how I've debated going
appreciate
forward.
it, yeah.
And I don't like introducing that negative energy to this conversation, but I think I could not, some people were so vehemently against it.
Yeah.
And it's like, why not entertain an option that more people could maybe benefit? So I leave it to you
Yeah.
now on that.
Sure, I'll make a few observations. One, that it's just cool that you could find that much content on degrowth and that there's been that much engagement with the concept. Um, and so that's just evidence that the conversation about planetary limits is ongoing. There's folks engaging with it on both sides. And right, if you don't rub a few folks the wrong way, or if you don't make enemies, I'm sure there's some saying, but if you don't generate some controversy, what are you really saying? And so I think sustainability, and you'll get several critiques of sustainability from me throughout this conversation, I'm sure, but I think one of the things the sustainability conversation tries to maintain is a win-win-win attitude that kind of allows you to say anything and have it be labeled sustainable or circular or green. And what degrowth is saying is we need a limit on the size of the economy in order to achieve our environmental and social justice goals. Those go together. So it's the limit on economic size that is tough for people. It's the one that generates the negative reactions. And I totally understand that this is not a conversation we're used to confronting. I like to say it's the first time in human history that as a global community, we are having a conversation about limiting growth. So it's going to be tough. I do want to provide a definition of degrowth, which is the Degrowth Institute's kind of opening definition, because I think it's good to have a one sentence
Great
definition to get us on the same page. So I've got degrowth is an intentional downscaling of the global economy, a necessary step for achieving ecological and social justice goals. And in that sense, by providing that one sentence definition, we provide something we can get behind. Notice that degrowth that definition does not say we're anti something. It does not say we're advocating for less something. We're advocating for an intentional downscaling, managed, coordinated, democratically decided,
Could then,
and it's
I think
necessary for goal
on
reaching
that note, then
goals.
I think it is important to, and thank you, Sabira, for this extra time here on. Could you go? I love that you, in one of your supplementary materials, you talk about what you are not. And you mentioned that just now. And I think it is important because I don't, I loved that essentially it was a concise way to say, hey, all of what you maybe read about this, or if you have, and I think myself is a great example of this. I have this preconditioned set of understandings of how we need to think about our economy, always going up and to the right. And anything that jeopardizes that notion is threatening to success in some way of our country or of our populations that are raising a sort of all, that our growing economy raises all boats, and it's like, well, that's not actually the case. And I think even my work in sustainability and circular economy is recognizing that's not always the case. But I think where my irrational reaction to that is almost is a little bit, at least, taken down a little bit. I don't know, is quelled by this sort of statement of what you are not, and trying to again say, hey, all of this is not, and I'm actually vamping right now as I try to pull it up. But all of this is not necessarily what we're about. Do you have it up if you're able to share quickly sort of these quick mission statements of what you find you are not? Maybe not all of the descriptions, but essentially those quick words of essentially saying, hey, just what you read is not actually what you hear and what we're trying to actually pursue.
Yeah, I do have a list of degrowth is not, and I've got a list here. But I just want to say, first of all, that
Yeah.
we might have jumped the gun a little bit because like my background is in sustainability, environmental impact reduction, and mainly in the waste sector and some transportation sector work. And so I came to degrowth from that pathway, saying, like, we've got all these great innovations and ideas, and people are working their butts off to reduce impacts and increase circularity and efficiency, um, with the assumption that the those impacts saved or avoided are actually banked somehow. And then working with corporations, looking at macroeconomic policy, looking at the global situation, having traveled a bit and spent time in places, and realizing that that's not what happens. Savings go into economic growth. So we make things more efficient. The economy uses the savings to grow primarily, and that kind of for long-term sustained ecological stewardship. And so I came at it that way. Now, my and so I've been thinking for like the last decade probably, man, we need a conversation about global limits. The degrowth movement is not my movement. I don't speak for everyone in the degrowth movement, but I found that people have been coalescing around this word as a way of bringing up limits, which is why I find it so powerful. There are a lot of people in degrowth that come from a decolonial perspective, a more historical perspective, looking at how development mechanisms are run, how the global financial system works. There are people that come from the angle of criticizing how we structure our economy, capitalism, socialism, communism. These are words that are super loaded and we can get into if you want. But so I just wanted to make that disclaimer too, along with this, that I think the power of being on this podcast is I get to talk with fellow material flow people, and kind of make the connection. Uh, but I've been doing a ton of learning as part of my own degrowth journey from other folks, from people who've been criticizing growth without the word degrowth, without the word sustainability even. So I say that as a segue to give you my list of what degrowth is not, um, and see where you go from there. Is that good?
this is an excellent, I think that was an excellent disclaimer of essentially saying this is where we're headed, this is why we're approaching these topics, and why I'm even trying to do this delicately, because I'm trying to then set the stage here a little bit, with
Cool.
an understanding of where I come from, Sabir comes from, where you come from, and then a concept that is rightfully challenging the growth limits that circular economy says that we might be able to aspire to. And we need to go, well, do we? Essentially. And is that actually ultimately our goal? And so with that, if you don't mind, actually, I'll just read through these real quickly. I was able to pull them up, which is everything that degrowth is not, which is it's not less of everything. It is not redefining economic growth. It is not about putting an economy into a recession. It is not about survivalism. And it's not about going backward. And those summarize a lot of almost the main points that I saw anybody online talking about negatively and almost hyperbolically. It is such an emotional, I guess, reaction. It immediately went to, oh, we're gonna. I mean, one of the headlines was how our society would fall apart if this was possible. It's like, well, okay, this is a mental exercise that we can have a nice discourse on this. So I've set this stage here. I've talked enough. I would love for Sabira to ask a question and then for us to continue to have this conversation.
Great.
I'm curious. So we know what it is and what it's not, but I think what's hard for me to kind of like paint the picture of my mind is, let's say today we are what we are today. And if the world were to embrace degrowth, the term and the way that you defined, what would the world look like? And what would be different than what we do today?
Well, that question could be, Sabira, it could be asking for like a vision of the future, which I'm always wary of because I spent a good amount of time my first job out of college, I should say, was in Washington, D.C. at the World Watch Institute, and that was 2010. 2009, 2010. So that's when the Kyoto Protocol was getting renegotiated. Obama had just come into office. We had high hopes for the U.S. getting on board with the Kyoto Protocol, and we were doing exercises of painting a picture of a sustainable future. What we called sustainable prosperity was the term then, and put a lot of work into like what a landscape, what a city with more bike lanes and solar panels might look like, and local gardens, and and these all, I think, perpetuated the win-win-win perspective rather than the win-win go on a diet perspective. I don't know what you want to say, but like the cool innovations, the great local efforts, plus macroeconomic limits, which is a whole project that needs its own attention, separate from all the technological innovations. And so instead of painting, and the idea was you could paint a picture that's attractive to people and win adherence that way to sustainability. But I think by not bringing in the macroeconomic picture, we allowed things to happen like what's currently happening with renewable energy, where renewable energy is growing worldwide, thank God. But guess what? So is the whole energy supply. So greenhouse gas emissions are growing right along with renewable energy growth because we're growing the whole pie of energy available. We didn't go back. We did the renewable energy advocacy, but we didn't advocate for limits on economic growth so that renewables could take a bigger share of the pie. And we didn't advocate for the corrections to equity and access to energy required for that additional renewable energy to be available to folks who didn't have it already. So I'm wary of painting a rosy picture. Instead, I'd like to say what we need is those connections. Those bridges to the future are going to look like things like degrowth conversations, like this podcast. They're going to look like corporations keeping track of their savings. And when we save via a circularity project or an efficiency project, are we tracking those savings and reinvesting them in ecological stewardship? So I usually kind of go for those types of visions about what the bridge is going to look like. And I think that'd be a place we could get into
Yeah,
if we
I
want to.
would want to. It's to me, it sounds like a reconfiguration, right? And I like the word diet that you use too. Is right if we try to humanize it a little bit, like if I'm normally I eat pasta for lunch, and now I eat salad. So that allows me to eat fruity pebbles as a snack, right? Like that's what we're kind of doing. But you're kind of saying you are eating a salad, there is a savings, and what are you spending on? Is it fruity pebbles or grapes or something else, right? So that the when corporations when let's if we fast forward to that bridge and corporations do account for their savings and do spend it on ecological rebalancing, what are some of like the top things that you would want them to be spending their savings on?
I had a gym. I used to go to a gym that where the like every at the end of every workout, the coach would say, like, "All right, go home and stack good habits." I don't know if you've heard that term, but like stack good. You did one thing good, stack other good things on top of it, rather than turning around and being like, "Got a good workout in. I'm headed to Lou Malnati's." Um, so yeah, I think that this diet language is appropriate in some cases. And so, yeah, I always think about it like that. Corporations would need to stack good habits. They would need to save resources up and down the supply chain, and then reinvest the savings. But I don't expect corporations to lead on that. I think we need corporations follow the rules ultimately. You know this in trying to get companies to adapt circularity practices. And I've heard this from several of your podcast guests too. Like, if it doesn't make sense, you can try with goodwill for a few years, but when it starts to wear down or really just not return, and then you drop the habits. So until those habits are fit with the economic structure that we have, um, we won't necessarily get the signal for them to stack good habits. And so I don't have a list of good habits. What we're focused on is getting folks to challenge the need for endless growth, and then generate by doing so by having conversations like this where we're openly talking about a limit on economic growth. Now you can think, yeah, I'm comfortable with the topic enough to consider solutions.
And
It's
so
not my job to think of all the solutions for everybody. We
does this,
definitely need distributed thinking on this.
to make the savings a little clearer then to our audience, and maybe me, I'll throw myself in this. When we're thinking about the savings, I mean, is this essentially challenging the notion, for an example, as one of the stacked type of good habits, a carbon credit type of allotment where companies are saying, hey, look at these offsets that we've purchased. So therefore, we can continue to scale, continue to grow as long as we offset that type of action. Is that the type of stacking of good habits where it's actually like, no, maybe offset, but maybe also double down and figure out different actions that will allow you to increase some type of action that affects a community or increases the resiliency or sustainability measures of their supply chain in the communities that they're affecting globally, instead of just thinking of an offset as a way to increase growth. Am I thinking of that correctly?
I
And no is a
Are
completely
you
appropriate answer.
questioning carbon offsets
I'm
as
questioning the
the
action of offsetting, and is that the type of degrowth mentality where it's saying don't necessarily focus on offsets as a way to increase growth, or even give yourself the excuse to eat fruity pebbles, to even give yourself the excuse to go and do the activity that you are continually conditioned to go do, but instead use it as a way to stack these habits. Am I off? Where am I off?
Well, I'm open to the concept of offsets, like theoretically, because
Yeah.
there's a lot of contradictions in degrowth, right? We want universal supports and equitable access to well-being for everybody, which implies some centralized efforts. But we also want the freedom for local communities to cooperate and build autonomy on their utilities. There's the municipalism movement, which you may have heard of, which is communities kind of taking more control over their utilities and
But
public services.
where I'm curious about that, let's use that as an example. Where
Yeah.
does that align with? Because I am actually more personally obsessed with when communities aren't getting the services they need, they band together, they build the service that they or invest in the service that they need, and it's a community owned asset. That doesn't. Why does that have a degrowth label, or is a part of a degrowth movement? When I view that as any sort of necessary function to grow whatever their economy is and their function, is this just about decreasing ownership and giving ownership back to a community, and therefore that's a part of sort of the precepts or these followings that degrowth sort of aspires to?
Yeah, there's a ton that is degrowth. So degrowth risks a circular economy phenomenon as well, which is where almost anything can be labeled as as degrowth compatible ultimately if it kind of increases people's engagement and it moves away from fossil fuels or moves away from the mainstream economic activities that we know are destroying the planet globally. So there's room there, but almost everything has to tie back to, and this is a growing thesis of mine, but it all has to tie back somehow to the realization that we need to cooperate internationally for a downscaling of the economy. So some of these items where we're talking about people's individual decisions or business decisions, what's really important with those is that they build commitment and openness to a world that has potentially different expectations around interest rates and how we structure retirements and how the world looks in terms of equity across political boundaries. So that has to be in the back of our minds. So I guess that's why I said I think you would get a negative reaction to the idea of carbon offsetting, since it's a cheap out for people with the resources from most degrowthers, along the lines that it's not kind of like morally aligned with degrowth. So I'm open to that argument, but I'm also open to the fact that we need to cooperate internationally. So
Well, I see. Yeah,
if there's a value exchange between countries as a part of offsetting, that could be a part of it.
I also see my error in bringing offsets into this conversation when they themselves are somewhat controversial. So I don't want to conflate anything in there.
Yeah, but it's tough. You have these conversations all the time. Sometimes we're talking about material flow and kind of quantifiable phenomena. Sometimes we're talking about economic and political phenomena, and sometimes we're talking about like morals way deep down, and it's tough. It's tough. And so one of the things we're doing is just inviting people. Like we have these cafes the first Thursday of every month here in Chicago. We've done a few virtual ones, still figuring that out, but just inviting people to come. Not necessarily a safe space to talk about degrowth, but I've heard people say brave space, a place to courageously confront growth in the context of your own work. And that's part of our mission, is to get people to talk.
Yeah, I'm curious how those go. But I think when you were talking about international limits and international cooperation, I was just starting to get curious. Okay, well, like, how do you get started, right? We try to do Kyoto Protocol, we try to do the Paris agreements. Like, when in your mind, like, what are the steps to get that kind of international cooperation?
There's a growing degrowth. I think movement building is part of it, and so some people are building the whole conversation around post growth, around just like the commitment to GDP. I have this other slightly longer definition of degrowth that I give sometimes, so I'll give it to you here, and then that'll have links to the international question. But degrowth is a reorientation of economic activity away from physical growth of the economy, social and financial necessity of economic growth, political commitment to GDP growth, and growth that primarily benefits the already wealthy. So in those 4 items, I gave you things that people across the world can get on board with, and they are. And so you have a actual post-growth conversation and funding happening in Europe. You have a decolonial conversation happening in North Africa and South America that's longstanding, but related to moving away from the international finance mechanisms kind of strong hand that requires growth of your economy to indicate well-being. And then the US obviously is the big bad gorilla in the room, so to speak. And so it's an important place to seed this conversation. But Degrowth Institute is 2 guys in an office plant here in Chicago and my co-founder out in California. And there's just so many people across the US that we're connected to now just since starting this institute that want to talk about this stuff. So some of it's movement building.
Well, and I see the value too of counter positioning yourself against GDP, where I actually start to lose a little bit of when I think about branding, when I think about the name, and I think what was and has been a movement for some time, and that you all are now doing more work in and more research and more in bringing sort of more, or at least building coalition around. This is where I love that I'm struggling with this, because when I hear you talk about stakeholder and rich stakeholder ownership of continued growth, and that it's only benefiting a fewer and fewer percentage points of the economy, and that more and more communities throughout the world are not actually able to own the infrastructure, own their growth, maybe not use that word, but own their growth in their communities. And I think why I struggle with growth is, I think you've made this point before, some will grow, some will degrow in a degrowth type of paradigm. The root of my question here, and I think this will vibe with Sabira in a major way, which is, in the degrowth ideology, I'm still struggling with growth, the degrowth language, when it's about actually growing other communities and getting ownership into the hands of a larger majority. And that degrowth doesn't seem to do it, that side of the movement, justice in terms of terminology. And that's where I struggle with that, because I tracked with so much of it, and even GDP, there's a lot that I track with in degrowth, and then I still find myself having these friction points. My questions are long here because you can tell I'm struggling. I'm struggling to reconcile so many things in this, and I love it. And that's the fun part of why I wanted to have you on the conversation today. This is also open-ended. I just shot a lot your direction. What hit you in that I suffered through in that question?
Well, one thing was that there are a lot of folks articulating alternatives to GDP, alternatives to metrics, the genuine progress indicator, and the gross national happiness. There's kind of like a growing movement around the concept of a well-being economy, and there's a buddy of mine. He's seeded a pretty good conversation on Instagram. His name's Michael Mez, Mezzatesta, Michael Mez on Instagram, and he's just got a great way of talking about the well-being economy, and he's kind of sponsored by the Well-Being Economy Alliance and the Earth for All movement, and so those are places I'd recommend folks go to find just a whole lot of really well articulated policies and directions that we could go away from GDP and away from growth. Donut Economics by Kate Rayworth is another big one. She's joined the circular economy with the social, the planetary boundaries with the social foundation, and using circularity as a way of getting within that donut of prosperity. And that's what the Spiral Economy article that I sent you is about as well. It's about joining circularity with limits on growth. What I love about degrowth, though, it doesn't let you escape from the limits question
Hmm.
in a word, at
I
least.
see.
It did a
Yeah.
decent job of doing that. I've been doing sustainability since I was a freshman in Students for a Sustainable Stanford, getting people to put the little please consider the environment before you print tag on your email, right? Do you remember that?
I do. Yes.
Yeah. So like 2004, people were still printing their emails. Um, People were still in the habit of like reading mail, so they printed
Just
their emails. And we had a whole campaign on campus to get people to put this please consider the environment tag and reduce the consumption of printer paper. We even tracked how much Stanford University spent on printer paper as a way to get there. Um, and at the same time, it's like Amazon and these shopping services were taking off, and the use of card. What I'm saying is, I went back and looked at the data. Printer paper has stayed level globally. The sale of printer paper since 2004 has not grown. The number, like total printer paper, is like 1 million tons per year, or sorry, 100 million tons per year. I'm gonna get those numbers for you later. But pa- paper use in packaging, cardboard packaging, has exploded. Um, and so, right, it's like we had the idea, right? We could do this awareness raising event and reduce paper use, printer paper use, which was successful. I'll give the little please consider the environment movement credit for that. But because there was no larger consideration about demand on trees coming generally from economic activity of any kind, right? It was kind of a failure, or it was at least a distraction, a good feeling distraction from folks who thought they were doing something good for trees. And because it was like a little tree symbol.
right. Right.
Now I'm thinking of the stickers that said these come from trees that you would see on paper towel dispensers. Do you remember those?
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Yeah. So I'm just saying that a lot of these new words, human flourishing, well-being, economy, they do risk uh, they risk missing the macroeconomic conversation or allowing you to leave it out.
So then what I love about what you just said is we have a nebulous topic like degrowth because it takes and I don't say this in a sort of in a bad connotation. It's a heady topic that takes in a lot of other communities.
Yeah,
And
that's for sure.
but what I love that you said is that then in that nebulous topic, the limit is also included in those topics. And essentially, degrowth is the one saying, hey, we believe in all of these things too, but we have to consider our planetary limit and our planetary floor in this type of conversation. And essentially where I can now admire the branding is it's just staying as true as possible, that saying, hey, while we explore all of these other growth opportunities for communities to own more potential own more assets, contribute to more and better well-being in these communities, that we have to still consider our planetary boundaries and our growth, and that is something where we need to think about how do we degrow. Um,
I'm
Again,
going to copy paste what you just said onto our
great.
website. I mean, I think you summarized it perfectly. We're
Well,
not
then I got there.
we're not anti. Yeah, you just finished your whole week long journey is done
Perfect.
now. Um, but
Excellent.
but yeah, I think that's the really positive energy that degrowth has, and when you come to a conversation, you'll feel it. It's like, yeah, I've been working my butt off on getting my my workplace to compost because I'm concerned. I'm genuinely disturbed by climate change or biodiversity loss or name the global phenomenon. And now it's saying we want those solutions to be long lasting and effective, and they need to be paired with a macroeconomic scene that is really that humans have never really wrapped their brains around, except in specialized and well-known examples of indigenous communities that have thrived and not thrived for a long time and not grown. But like modern, communicating with the average Chicagoan about this requires just this constant reminder about limits to growth, and we're going to have to share. in the solution generating.
Well, I was curious because it sounds like you're saying movement building and having these like cafes, education, that this is how you get the ball rolling. Have you found other like tactics or ways to educate? Like Gar went through his own educational journey, right? And this, or concluding here for this week. But how do you
Yeah,
take
live.
others?
I've done it live. Yes.
Yeah. How do you, like, what has worked for you and the Degrowth Institute to kind of bring people into the fold?
Well, I think Gar's journey included being able to read up on stuff. And one of the things that I found really powerful is however you want to view political boundaries, it is powerful if you're in the US to read an American author on this stuff or a team. And at Purdue, I started talking about degrowth in the classroom kind of right off the bat 2 years ago, and I was teaching full time. Had some students say, "We want to do more. We want to hear more about this." So we got together for coffee one day, did a little pre-reading. I sent them an article that my buddy Eric Asadorian at the World Watch Institute had written about degrowth back in 2010. Um, and it's kind of my favorite intro to degrowth. We read that article, we discussed it. Students were like, "Can we do this again?" We scheduled another one. So pretty soon we were meeting once a month in a degrowth coffee hour, degrowth colloquium, talking about degrowth. And it was like students that are talking about sustainability or they're doing it in their research all day, every day, and could tell that there's a missing piece. And we opened up that door for them. And we found that they wanted to communicate. So we wrote our own. I'm going to stand up for a second and just grab it for you for example. We wrote our own. I got some black and white copies. We wrote our own like 2-pager. The students got together and kind of
And we'll
collaborated
link to
on
that.
this
It was very
summary
good.
of degrowth. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's in Spanish and English, and a very wide-ranging group of students, grad, undergrad, international students, domestic students got together, and this turned out to be the most powerful tool. Not any science article um, or kind of famous name book, but just something we had collaborated on and written from our voice. And so we want to generate more content like that people are comfortable sharing, becomes powerful in the context of local voices, US perspective. And I think that's one of these kind of movement generating pieces of work that we'll be doing.
Now, this is where I would love to start getting into what's the effort to communicate this, both to consumers, to policymakers, to anybody within and this may not be appropriate, so ding me if it's not. How do we limit this action of what we're doing to maybe our US system? How are we engaging within the United States in these topics? Is it going well? Do you find that it's growing and that there's actually room for exploring what is a critical perspective? Is it not going well? What's sort of the current progress that you all have seen? Because you've been working in this now some time. I'm curious on the sort of tracking the pattern of adoption from your perspective and from what you've seen, at least in the last few years.
Well, there's my own personal journey too, which is just getting more comfortable with saying degrowth out loud and realizing that, yeah, I can be a professional, professional person with experience and my own experience and observations in the workplace and working my own butt off on sustainability are really end up being the most powerful thing. And knowing that I'm comfortable with that has enabled other people to talk about
to also
degrowth,
be comfortable.
But I've become comfortable because other people have enabled me.
Okay, this seems like well, this is what's fascinating about that. And I would love to get to how you communicate this to other policymakers and consumers. But in a quick aside, when you said it allows me to say it out loud, and this is a dangerous thing what I'm about to do here, but I think it's fascinating, in which there are so many academics that have wanted to pursue the science behind the paranormal.
Mm-hmm.
And they haven't even felt comfortable saying that because of the stigma. And so when I hear you say, I'm not aligning these two, I'm no way aligning degrowth with the paranormal. But when I hear you say that you're comfortable saying degrowth in your own professional context, that immediately took me to a place where it's like, is there that much stigma academically still, or even professionally, where that's still a hurdle for some people to sort of buy into this concept?
Well, that is something that needs to be said. I do. It's important for degrowthers to acknowledge the real benefits that growth has delivered. You know, it's not like some big green monster. Uh, it's so it is. There is a stigma, but for good reason. I think growth has been a signal or a decent indicator of, yeah, job. I got a raise, right? I mean, everybody likes to get a raise. Everybody likes to get a bonus at the end of the year, and everybody likes to save for retirement and dream about their beach vacation, and put away for their kids, right? And hope for more for their kids. Like there's a natural commitment to growth. It's not just a statistical thing. And so I don't, I think that there's a very natural stigma to come out and say degrowth. It can be scary for folks who are living on the edge. It sounds like a, privileged guy with a PhD coming out and saying, let's degrow the economy. And I'm in downtown Chicago with a beautiful view of Lake Michigan. So that there's some cognitive dissonance there that degrowth owes itself to struggle with as well. And so I think maybe it's not just people are totally open to the concept, but I think become comfortable struggling with that cognitive dissonance, recognizing that I'm entangled in the growth system. My daughter, we just opened up a 529 college savings plan for my daughter, right? Which we're hoping to
Gross.
grow by the time she's 18 years from now, or 17 years from now. No. But, right, so we're all entangled in the system, but I think it's gotten to the point where the global conversation about controls on climate and biodiversity loss continually disappoint. And we have to point the finger at the economy, not just those negotiators. And there's a space for that conversation that is academic, that's popular, that's activist, that's popular with young people. And we're trying to fill it in with quality, human-centered, or like planet and human-centered thinking that acknowledges we're all entangled. And it's tough.
I would love to turn this back over to Sabira. I think we've got some extra time too to get still into some more topics. One of those is it's that relationship then of communicating this to the local effort, or to the ground movement, and the groundswell around this movement. How does someone take on this concept in their everyday life? We mentioned that it's so hard for us to view, or we view growth so positively. How can someone sort of start to engage in this? Is this decreasing consumption? Is this how does this sort of play out?
Yeah, I'll give another plug on that because it makes me think of a conversation I had a couple weeks ago at the Degrowth with the Chicago Degrowth Book Club discussion, which our friend Elise O'Malley organizes with Breck Bounds, and we've been reading Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer this fall. And Breck, who's one of the leaders, was saying that, yeah, there's a woman in my neighborhood. She runs the local community garden. She's basically always talking about degrowth things. She never doesn't know the word degrowth. I invited her to this book club, but she said she'd rather spend time in the garden. And so that was what Breck said. And I thought that was great, right? I think that the way I would like a lot of people to engage is like, keep doing what you're doing. Keep working on circularity and local food. Like if your heart is in the right place and you're thinking hard about it, we've gotten so confused in sustainability where we're like thinking about the numbers. Like, well, if I compost that still has carbon emissions. Like, would it be better for me to gasify my, should I be doing biochar and go vegetarian? And we're trying to optimize all these things all the time with statistics and numbers. At the end of the day, it's like if your heart's in the right place and you're struggling and you're trying to change for the larger environmental picture, you're going to find a way. And then there's folks like me, and I think there's a growing number of folks who aren't comfortable at that level. I, at some point, was not comfortable with just managing waste and moved into the degrowth space for that reason. And we need those folks to be in communication and talking with economists and learning their international policy and pushing international cooperation towards degrowth. But like, I would hate to say that there's a degrowth, that I would ask sustainability advocates who are working every day like you to do something differently necessarily, except one thing, which is to always ask what happens to the savings. And that I've encouraged many sustainability advocates and consultants especially to ask their clients. I'm going to do this project. We're going to save you X amount of tons per week or kilowatt hours per month. It's going to save you this much. That's how we finance the project. Is there a way we can track the savings? I've asked a few clients that over the years. A lot of them have said that would require a change to our like accounting principles. It would mess up how we budget for projects the next year. But you got to at least ask and you got to at least try. And that starts to point our thinking towards the macroeconomic context.
I think the like
So
psychological.
what happens to the savings?
Yeah, what happens to the savings? Great. That's a good like tangible thing to do. The psychological like cognitive dissonance that you talked about is really interesting to me. Is as practitioners, we can acknowledge that we're entangled. We are doing the best that we can with the skills and our roles in society. And we still like I still walk into Home Sense, I need curtains, and I feel like a sense of vomit when I'm like, this is all the shit that is being manufactured for Christmas every year, and how many Home Senses are there in the US? And there's, just like above ground land. But I start to like that psychological, I'm part of the problem. I see the problem, I have a reaction to the problem. Um, I'm curious, like and normally we ask this question towards the end of the podcast, but as you're giving this advice of, ask about the savings, like how do you still stay hopeful? Or there's all these humans around us that don't think the way that we think. And so we're like bumping into them in everyday life. So how do we, yes, we're doing the movement building, yes, we're doing the education, but how do you stay hopeful, and how do you encourage others to stay hopeful?
Yeah, I totally get like the holidays will just bring it out in you, and you just see, especially if you're a material thinker, you go into places and you're just like building the supply chain back to the earth on everything you look at, and then just seeing oil everywhere, basically. If it's petroleum or a synthetic fabric or a pharmaceutical or a scent or a dye, it's just fossil fuels. Um, and and so you don't even have to visit a gas station or fill up a car, and you can go be disturbed. So I thank you for acknowledging that. I have those same thoughts. Uh, but but there's power in having this conversation and starting to build that understanding. And I think that a lot of folks are burning out on just the stuff, right? I watched it happen with having a child, and we successfully dressed our baby for the first year in like no new clothes. And that wasn't because we did a big extra effort to go thrift shopping. Our friends just dumped their extra clothes on us, their 1-year-old clothes on us. And we made it happen. And I have been shopping at Once Upon a Child, which is an amazing store that recycles kid stuff. And it's just the coolest, old school business model. It's like Play It Again Sports. You remember Play It Again Sports? Yeah. And
It's my favorite. Yeah.
dude. And so I can't wait for our daughter to be Play It Again Sports status too. But So I get uplifted by this fact that stuff like that is working. The average shopper there is not an eco enthusiast; they're just a normal person. And then the last thing is, a lot of folks do have thrift built in. Like, you know, if something breaks when I'm at drill, I'm in the National Guard. When I'm at drill weekend, if something breaks, like a valve on a, on a Humvee gets loose, or a bolt flies off, or like people are the soldiers I work with are so innovative. Like they'll find a way to fix it. This guy fabricated. We had a lever on a large truck that we have break off, and he just went and fabricated one, like from metal himself. And I think maybe us folks who are stuck in consulting land or professional managerial class don't see that as much, but there's just so much innovation and thriftiness and scrappiness that people can thrive outside of just material excess and new stuff all the time. That's not to say we don't have a big fight to fight when it comes to the stream of stuff going through Amazon, right? Those are committed investments. Those Amazon warehouses are going up with 30-year leases. They are committed to filling them constantly over the next 30 years. And that's the large signal we have to resist and struggle with.
I will speak for myself here as a host, as we got to witness my own journey of adoption of degrowth and understanding it. I'm not totally confident that I've hit the mark as a host in exploring all of the good nuances of degrowth. Where did we fall short? Did anything hit you where you're like, man, I wish we had talked about this? Anything that we could sort of close out on where you're like, I would love to talk more about the material flows, and with respect to degrowth and circular economy. What hits you right now where we could essentially leave our audience with one more nugget of knowledge?
Yeah, degrowth is like, I think it's like being a kid in a candy shop, right? There's just so
Yeah.
many things to talk about. I don't think we can leave this conversation without recognizing that we are three Americans talking about an intentional downscaling of the global economy. And I have to say again that is, there's a lot of people in the world who listen to this and say, well, easy for you to say. And that's a good chunk of the global economy. I think no matter what, I did this, I had my students do this stat last year, but it's like if you just paid taxes in the US and sat on the couch and did nothing else, your carbon footprint would be like twice as much as the global fair share carbon footprint, just from the government services that you get, with no other personal purchases on top of it. So we are the average taxpayer if you're able to pay taxes, and there are a lot of folks in the U.S. that don't, that are below that level. But if you're able to pay taxes, you're already in the global 10%. And I just wanted to say that out loud. Like, it is a privileged conversation to have, but we need to have it, and it should come with, I would hope, like, I'm just going to speak for myself, but it should hopefully come with a clear commitment to myself saying, I'm willing to have a less material intensive lifestyle. I'm willing to aim for a retirement that is less material and monetary intensive than my current life, as a part of the sustainability movement and as my care for global humanity. But also, I'm confident we can build an economy where that looks really exciting for the future. Uh, but I have to say that I as an already high consumer, am willing to come down. That opens up ecological space for folks who don't have as much, but it also has to be part of a coordinated degrowth.
What I love about this conversation, and it hit me somewhere in where you were delivering some great points on how to think about our own personal relationship to our impact. My first foray into sustainability came when I just wasn't totally subscribing to absolute free market economies, where, and what I love about this is it takes it one more step further into nuance and care and trying to think deeply and critically, because I do believe that when you think critically of something, you are respecting it and you are trying to augment it for more
Sure.
humane purposes. But this seems in direct opposition to the free market, and then the free sort of the laissez-faire attitude, to use other types of economic terms, towards just whatever happens in our economy. Whatever people want to choose, they can choose all of that. But I think we are entering a phase of nuance. We are entering a phase of, especially coming out of a new election cycle, that I think there's deeper critical thought that needs to go into how we're structuring our lives and our economy to benefit more. And I appreciated this conversation here today to get me to better understand how degrowth fits into that picture.
Cool. And there's a lot more articulate folks in the degrowth movement on ways of structuring the economy. And I think I can speak for some of them in saying most of our economies are mixed, right? Their government controls aspects of it for public safety and well-being, while letting competition reign in certain parts. And so, whatever you want to call it, a part of our dialogue gets a little sidetracked when we go into capitalism, socialism, communism. Marxism was the big one in our recent election. And I think you're kind of miscommunicating as soon as you're using those terms. But
Yes.
an economy where we take control of the endless flow of stuff from the Earth system away from a stable Earth system to the human economy will require a confrontation with growth, economic growth. And that's going to have to include local innovation and centralized cooperation at some level, like we'll call it international cooperation, and traditional government. We're playing its role. I don't have all the vocab beyond there, so I'll take the engineer. I'll play with the engineer card and leave it at that on that question. But yeah, it's a great observation.
I appreciate that, and I think to round that out, and Sabir, I'll let you close us out, which is people then need to, maybe ironically, I don't know, but they need to own more. And this is a moment where more communities have the moment to step up, potentially be more connected, have these conversations, talk to your neighbors, figure out what you want to do with your communities. And this is that moment to, I think, really start to coalition build, and degrowth might fit into that. Any thoughts there to round us out, John and Sabira?
I was just going to say that I think what I'm taking away is this feeling that I've grown up with, being the daughter of an immigrant, is like I have this international connection to some other place in the world that isn't the global north. And I grew up with this feeling of both like guilt and interest into my role in have and have nots. And I think this conversation degrowth kind of encapsulates that. Is like you have to acknowledge your role in the world, and that's at the individual, local government, national government level. And it sounds like, John, your point of view is that once we have that kind of acknowledgement, then we can actually get to a point where we are actually more economically sustained and balanced than we are. And it's hard to feel that global connection on a day-to-day basis, but this conversation brought me home to that. So I thank you for that, John.
Cool. That's what I was going to say. It was like, we're Degrowth Institute's doing its job right now and having this conversation. And thanks for being part of it and inviting me on. Our job is to empower people to challenge the idea of endless growth. And so, and knowing that folks already come into that with expectations, with family background, everything from family backgrounds to education and concepts, and having tried things at work and typically aren't in the right place, no matter where they're coming from. And so that's our job. And we're going to be putting more tools online for folks to use in starting their own degrowth discussion groups, seeding a degrowth conversation at their university or in their workplace. That's what will be our first online content. If you go on our website right now, it's very shell. It says like we're getting ready to launch, basically, and it has some snail drawings, which are fun. But we'll have content like that coming out. We have our Degrowth cafes, which you can come to in Chicago, first Thursdays. There's several book clubs around the city that touch on these concepts. There's a huge solidarity economy movement in the city to get involved in, and that has to do more with cooperative work and work arrangements and things. And we're just going to be sharing that. And then summer 2025, we'll have a degrowth school in the city. It'll be a chance to spend 3 days with degrowth instructors. We'll probably get students from across the country, and then we'll have a convergence of sorts for degrowth movement folks to get together in person in Chicago, the most train accessible city in the country, and kind of spark the next phase of degrowth movement in the U.S.
Great call to action. Thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you. This was awesome. And we'll be in touch again soon. I would love to, I would love to make the connection to circular economy more and your work on the next conversation over
a good
coffee
call-out.
or beer.
We might need another part 2 of the podcast because we scratched the surface. So yes, part 2 on the way then at some point. Thank you, John.
Thanks, you too. Have a great day.